You raised the issue of budgets and cutting of budgets. I feel like every class that I teach, we end up getting back to the issue of allocation of funding, whether it's the international level or here at the local level. How do you, in your positions with your organizations, have your organizations tried to address the sort of diminishing budgets while watching the police department budget balloon to a number that all of our students love hearing? Everyone say it at once.
11 billion.
Right. So they all know the budget of the year. Talk about it all. How do you deal with it?
Yelling and screaming. In a couple different ways. And so I think in our work, we talk about like an inside, outside game. And for our outside game, that's really a lot of like political education, community education. A lot of people don't know what our city budget is. It's like hundreds of pages. It's impossible to read. It's very hard. And that's intentional. Like it's not an accessible document. But our position is like our budget is a moral document. And so it really shows where our priorities are and what we care about. And as you all know, we care a lot about policing in this city. And so through our coalitions, and so we are a part of Communities United for Police Reform, which is about like ending abusive policing practices. And then we're also a part of the People's Plan, which is providing like this holistic vision for a safer New York, not just around policing, but like every facet of social justice in the city. And we have like defund tabling. We talk to folks in the community, and there are some like really cool graphics that we have, which is like for every $1 that goes to NYPD, like a penny goes to like workforce development, a penny goes to aging, like 3 pennies go to education, and really illustrating how our budget is playing out in real time. Because as community organizers, we want to really agitate community members and get them fired up about like how our money is being spent. And then the inside game is more about also education of our electeds, because they are still people and no one knows how to read a budget. And just like really showing them like, this is what is happening in the budget. These are the things that as community members, we're saying will make our community safer. And really trying to create a cohort of lawmakers who are aligned with us, who are willing to fight alongside us against this administration, but just really against a narrative that lies about what safety actually is. And I think one of the challenges is making sure that like budget fight is happening year round. I think across the board, like criminal justice spaces, any kind of justice space, there's a lot of lack of capacity just because there's a lot of terrible things happening. And we're trying to put out fires everywhere. And so what ends up happening is that we're in a very reactionary space where you have Eric Adams putting out a preliminary budget that is seeking to cut agencies. And so we're responding to him instead of having the capacity to do the work ahead of him. And really set the tone for what we want the budget to be. And I think that is something that we're currently building out in coalition spaces so that we are in a more offensive posture when budget cycles come around. We've already done that outside game work because a lot of electeds will say, you know, well, I'm not hearing this from my constituents. And so making sure constituents are in a place where they're educated enough to call their elected leaders and be like, this is what I want to see in the budget. This is what I don't want to see in the budget. And so right now in this budget session, we're really fighting against cuts as opposed to fighting for a more affirmative vision of what safety looks like because we're being attacked so heavily by this current administration.
Yeah, this has been on my mind a lot. I have just been really generally frustrated recently. I think about this, you know, I'm sure many of us get those emails from a million different good causes asking us to donate on a regular basis. And this is something that's been on my mind a lot. It's just, there are all these good causes out there and all these things we're fighting for, and they all depend on the generosity of just all of us to continually give them money. And it frustrates me that there's just not just like a natural allocation of money in maybe our government budgets and our state budgets that go towards all of these nonprofits and good causes. But could rant about that for a long time, but that's what's been on my mind. But we do a similar thing in that we lobby as a CDRC network in the state to the elected officials, trying to get some money out of the budget for our network. We do get some money from the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice and the Office of Court Administration. That budget does fluctuate. So during the pandemic, they weren't sure what money was going to look like. They slashed all the budgets. And then now they're saying, oh, we could go back to pre-pandemic levels, but it's very hard. It doesn't really allow you to grow properly. You always have to worry about capacity issues. So the budget that they give each center is $500,000. The current budget for New York Peace Institute usually is around 1.5 million, which means there's a lot of money that has to be made up through fundraising, private donations, and the primary way that we make up a lot of our money is through a training budget. So we offer our mediation trainings for a fee, and which comes with this whole set of other issues. But if we don't do that, we don't actually have enough money to then do the work that we want to do. And one of the very complicated things for us that happened, particularly if I think leadership started to think about this in the wake of Black Lives Matter, which was that we were doing training for NYPD. And so they had just kind of like let that happen for a long time. And then when all of a sudden there was a lot of public outcry about maybe this doesn't make sense, like maybe we shouldn't be supporting NYPD in any way, or maybe then they started to think about, okay, maybe we need to change our training model. To be fair, they were getting a lot of money from those NYPD trainings. So they were kind of stuck in this fight of, we want the money to do the work, going into courts, taking things out of court. Also, we don't necessarily want to be working so closely with NYPD at this time. And they eventually decided to pause those trainings and have not resumed them. But it was a very challenging thing. And so if these networks were not so reliant on this funding from all these trainings, then there's more flexibility in the work that we can do as well. So I think that's always something that comes up.
Like scribbling, I don't know if you want to.
Just one thing, I think another part about budget stuff that's difficult is that there's, specifically with regard to the NYPD, there's a lot of things that are not transparent. And so before we can even like fully attack the budget, we're like, we need to actually know what's in the budget, which requires like legislation and all these things. So it's like we're passing bills to get transparency around the budget so that we can have a proper budget fight. And it is very circular and very frustrating. But yeah, so that's another piece that we don't actually know all of what the budget is.
This might be slightly obvious, but just for everybody in the room, since we have quite a few students, younger people here, what should people be doing if they want to see more of their budget going to activities like your organizations or New York Peace Institute? And, you know, I don't know if I can say less going to the NYPD, but you know, just to support that shift in priorities.
I mean, I think it's just endless organizing, endless grassroots organizing, and really being involved in local politics. So side note about me, a couple of years ago, I ran for a local position. And even as someone running in that position, I did not understand how much happens at the local level until I was actually involved in it every day. And a lot of us just kind of dismiss that level. We're like, okay, what's happening at the national level? Like, what senators should we contact for what's happening? You know, and to be fair, there's a lot happening at the national level that we need to be involved in, but also like these everyday, like the transparency around the budgets, like that's going to be your city council, that's going to be your elected officials in Albany. And so actually seeing what they're doing, many of them in office for decades without any competitors, without anybody questioning what they're doing or what they're voting for or what they're passing. If we were more involved in those elections, there's usually about 10% turnout for a local primary in New York City. So if we were voting and getting people out of office when they were not meeting what we hope to have happen budget wise, I mean, I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah, echo all of that. And I think it's deep, like local, like your community board and things like that. And so I think to the extent you have capacity to go to community board meetings, like elected officials will hold town halls. If you go to those, and NYPD goes to all of those. And so like, that's also like inside information that they're getting, but you can also like hear about how they're talking to community members. There's a ton of fear mongering that happens in these meetings. That is best to like, just like for you all to know that it's happening. And then it's individuals like your electeds work for you. You can walk into their district offices and say, this is where I want the money to go. But I do think a lot of it comes down to like organizing. So, you know, if there are people in your neighborhood that are also working on these things, like team up with them. Like if there are organizations that are working on budget justice things, team up with them. And if folks are really interested, I could definitely like point you in directions of folks who are doing that work. But it does take like collective power because, you know, as an individual, you can only do so much. If there are tens of you, if there are hundreds of you, if there are thousands of you, we can do even more. So organizing is huge.
One of the, I think, really interesting things that happened in our first seminar, which where we had the young public safety advocates from Red Hook Initiative and Obi who was here. And we did an exercise of, you know, we asked the NYU students, you know, what is peace? What is peace building? Or like, what do you think of when you think of conflict, you know, and public safety? And a lot of it was police and like, you know, subways and different things like that. And when we posed the question to the safety advocates from Red Hook, who, you know, are in a very overly police marginalized community, they were saying a bank, a library, a school, education, right? And I think that kind of highlights and draws this connection to the global affairs discourse that we're having of how important it is to ask local community members what it is that they need to feel safe. And I think, again, that's not something that we're great at doing kind of on the city government level, even if we can say that's something that should happen over there in that other country, which even that's a struggle. But so to that point, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit on what that affirmative vision for safety is that is put forth, even though not fully yet, because you have to be on the defensive, by this coalition of people who are trying to find non-militarized solutions to making our city safer.
A ton of things. I think it's like a complete moving away from the carceral system as a way to address harm. It is a permanent housing guarantee for everyone. It's universal basic income. It is free public transit. It is like never before seen investments into education and libraries. It is like violence interruption programs. It is adequate mental health care and like mobile street teams that can meet people where they are. It is like, it's a lot. Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer is just like, it is stability and resources. It is making sure people have what they need in order to thrive. And that's not something I think we've ever had or that our government has ever been interested in creating. Because, you know, we know that like drivers of crime and behavior that's being criminalized is poverty. And poverty is a policy choice. Like we could decide as a city that no one is poor here. And that just takes like political will, that takes organizing, that takes folks like demanding that people have like the resources that they need. And I do think it's like not enough to just like ask people what they need in order to be safe. It's also like just presenting like a menu of possibility. Because one of the things that we encounter in the work that we do with like wanting to divest from police, people are like, well, if we don't have police, like what are we gonna do? And it's really like creating that space for imagination and problem solving and conflict resolution that, you know, because we're constantly in crisis, we don't have space to do that. I think one person in a meeting brought up like, oh, well, there was a child who was autistic on the train and was like harmed on the train. And then they called the police. And then their solution was like, oh, we need to blame the parents. And I'm like, what if we don't have to blame anyone? What if we're like, you know, we want to make sure that, you know, autistic children are autonomous. but like have the resources that they need. So is that like investment in escorts? Like we want to make sure that parents are able to like have work, but also do childcare. And it's like, is that like a better work-life balance? Like, how can we be like investing in things that actually create the world that we want to navigate in without like blaming people and saying like, well, this person did something wrong. It's like really looking at like, what is the root cause of the harm that happened and how can we like reorient government in a way that addresses that root cause without causing harm. And it's not easy.
And it strikes me that mediation plays a really important role in that. And I'm wondering in the conversations that you have with city government who do fund your work and who do refer people to you, is government buying in, are the people you're working with buying into that? Are you able to kind of have, now that this conversation is evolving, are you able to sort of work of New York Peace Institute and the possibilities and the imagination?
Yeah, so I think there's this ideal world for us, which involves everything you've just said. But in addition, when we're focusing just on mediation, it also involves when there is a conflict, when people have a conflict, their first thought should be conflict resolution, should be mediation, should be a community search, should be a facilitation, should be something that's outside of the court system. And so our ideal is that everybody knows what mediation is, everyone knows what conflict resolution is, has some of those skills themselves, and that's how disputes are handled within the city. So that's the goal. And I would say over the course of time, we've seen baby steps with mediation, particularly in the court system, but just in general, we're seeing that more and more people are knowing about it, but it is slow, and outreach into the communities is really slow just because we don't have the resources to actually send somebody to say, hey, somebody go to all the churches in Brooklyn and let them know about these resources. Like somebody go to every senior center and let them, and we don't have that, but that's like our ultimate goal. But what we're seeing in the court system, particularly recently, is a small shift to starting to do alternative dispute resolution instead of court. So one of the main programs that we have actually with this is in the small claims court. And now there's a program in place where everybody who has a filed small claims case goes to mediation first, at least to talk to us. You don't have to, it's still a voluntary process. So you're not mandated to do mediation. They call it presumptive mediation. You're not mandated to do mediation, but you're required to just talk to us about what it is. And if it sounds like you would like to resolve your dispute that way, great. And then if we resolve it, we write up an agreement for you, we send it to the court, you're done. You don't ever have to go into the court at all. And so we're seeing those steps in other courts. We're seeing housing court finally opening up a little bit to letting us mediate and being in housing court. We're there in some aspects of criminal court. We're there in some aspects of family court. So we're like seeing these baby steps. And I think it's really important because, to your point way earlier, when we mediate instead of going through the court system, or when we mediate instead of like just trying to let conflict simmer, we're actually allowing the people closest to the issue to resolve their own, in our vernacular, we call it self-determination. So they're saying, you create your own agreement. What does that look like? What do you want in there? And you could be creative about it. It doesn't have to fit into the confines of like what the court has said it has to fit into. So.
Are you all using, the terminology of restorative justice? Now, because I feel like that also has really caught on, and I think there are a lot of really interesting links with the way that that's, particularly with Indigenous communities, for example, in Columbia. This is something that we talked about with our students in Columbia quite a bit.
Yeah, so we have a restorative justice arm, and we do try to incorporate some restorative justice practices into our general mediation practice, but it does have very distinct features. And so we do have a restorative justice arm that primarily focuses on the school system. So trying to implement restorative justice practices in a high school, for example. We're in a few high schools in the city. So instead of having a punishment system of you're suspended, you're expelled, reinforcing that prison pipeline, instead of that, we're saying like, okay, what if, because you had a food fight or you started a food fight in school, we get everybody who is impacted by that and bring them together for a discussion about who was harmed, what does that mean? What needs to happen to address that harm? And so that tends to be more of these like community circles, bringing a group of people together for these restorative justice practices, and then just as many elements as we can incorporate into mediation. But it's like a booming field, and I think it's really great, but definitely incorporating it carefully, and particularly like trying not to co-opt what Indigenous communities have done for so long, but just take some things that we can incorporate, I think is really important.
So it strikes me that you're both, I mean, you're laying out these really, broad, ambitious visions for what could be. And yet, in terms of the day-to-day sort of conversation of the city, we're still stuck in a crisis mentality, not just here, but most places in the world. It's something that we talk about globally, right? Something like Ukraine happens and suddenly you cannot talk about anything else, right? Everything goes there. What's the mechanism to start to get people out of the crisis mentality to think about the other, the more expansive visions you're talking about? Is it simply a matter of education? Is it a matter of education plus media? Is it, what institutions need to be involved in order to sort of drive that shift?
Because I guess I don't know that we're trying to get people out of the crisis mentality, particularly for the work that Vocal is doing, because we want them to like admit that we are in a crisis.
We're not doing it.
Homelessness, like it's unprecedented, the amount of homelessness that we have. And it's disgusting when you think about how many vacant units there exist in the city. Like we could in homelessness today. Like right now, everybody could have a home. And so I think the like smaller concrete thing is like, we're trying to make it so there's something called city FEPS vouchers, and the housing stuff is not my wheelhouse. So don't ask any follow-up questions.
I can supplement.
Okay, perfect. But what's happening is like, we have a lot of our members who are voucher holders, which basically is like the city giving them rent. But what's happening is that they're going to landlords, getting into apartments and being like, okay, here's my voucher. And then landlords are like, no, never mind, I don't want to rent to you, which is illegal. But the like agency in the city who is supposed to be doing these, what is it called? It's like anti-discrimination work.
Oh yeah, the New York City.
Yeah.
Discriminate, yeah.
There's no attorneys there. And so there's like an agency that's underfunded. So it's like, there are like things that could happen today to make it so that people are better able to like get into homes that is not being done. And so I think like letting people know that that is a crisis. Similarly for like overdoses, again, unprecedented levels of overdoses happening in the city. I think this is one part where there's actually alignment. And so it's not as hard as a push on the city level around like expanding overdose prevention centers. And so that's like an easier lift. And then for like mass incarceration, we're trying to close Rikers, and we have our current administration trying to delay the closing of Rikers. But these are all like crises that are happening, overlapping at the same time that are being ignored. And so I think we do, in a way, want to alarm people about what's happening, but in a constructive way, not like in a fear-mongery, like, okay, lock everybody up kind of way, but it's like, we have the resources to actually create peace, create safety, and we're not using them because no one is really alarmed. Like we're like, okay, we don't care about these people anyway. And so it's like, how do we actually create a government that like cares about the folks who are like closest to the margins? And that's hard.
And I think the people who are paying attention are like alarmed about so many things.
Yeah.
Like there's just, because I know, and it's kind of to your point, like I know that I just often feel bombarded. There's like so many things to care about, and like where do you start and what do you focus on? And so that's really tricky. I would say that from like the mediation conflict resolution perspective, education would probably be like the number one thing that we would focus on. So that goes back to funding public schools in their entirety so that they're all these additional programs that they aren't able to afford to have right now. But if we had conflict resolution skills in elementary school and middle school, if we had civics classes from the very beginning. So you're learning about like how your government works, what is actually happening in your local government, how you're a good citizen, how you're involved. If we were already teaching students how to understand the dynamics of housing and the dynamics of policing and the entire time, I think that starts to change the conversation. I generally feel like there's been this push to not teach this at a young age. And so unless you decide that you want to study this when you get to undergrad or graduate school or maybe high school, depending on where you go, you're not learning about any of this. And that's too late. Like we should, the schools that, even the elementary schools that had these peer mediation programs, they're already, or restorative justice programs, they're already doing so much better than the other schools because their students are learning how to speak to each other, how to be in conflict with each other in a healthy way. And so that's always our focus, is on that education. And then there's a million institutions that we could focus on, but that's, I think education is the main one.
Sure, we don't, yeah. Emily, do
Oh,
you
no,
have-
I don't know.
Oh, I'd love to open it up to others who want to join the conversation.
Unless somebody else wants to.
Oh, yeah.
You sure? Interesting data point, and then I have a couple of thought suggestions or questions as well. The UN budget is 3.4 billion. If you include the peacekeeping budget, it's 6 billion. So the total UN budget for all of peacekeeping worldwide is less than the new NYPD budget. No, it's
Yeah.
6 plus 3.4.
Oh, 6 plus 3.
So you're close to it, but it's still less than that. So just data point, interesting data point. But the point I wanted to make was, and I think this is one of, it's fascinating to see, and thank you so much for bringing this up from that local perspective. But in a way, what seems to be missing and might be actually very useful is also to connect it to the global perspective, in particular, the Sustainable Development Goals. And the reason I mention that is if this country had done what was known as a voluntary national review, it may be less of an opportunity. But shockingly, this country, along with, I think, North Korea, so South Sudan, and maybe Iran has not done a voluntary national review. However, the New York City has done what's called a voluntary local review of saying how we are on track to meet the goals in 2030. One of those goals is goal 16, peaceful societies. And I think just linking up some of this, and actually the city representatives go to the UN, make that pitch. I don't know whether they're doing it this year because there's a number that very easy to find out, happens in June. There's what's known as the high-level political forum. What's very interesting about that platform is that in the past, we've had other countries, I can think of India, for example, which have come up and said, we're doing such a fantastic job on the SDGs, and actually NGOs sitting inside or outside saying, well, actually, it's slightly different, and so maybe kind of raising that and perhaps making those linkages may be another way to connect the very local, the very global, and also kind of say, hey, New York City, you are not standing up to what you've promised the world.
Yeah. Also, that just makes me think about when we're talking about housing, housing or something like that. You could look at the housing crisis in many cities across the entire world. And so there, I agree with you. I think there's plenty of ways to link them and then to also try to learn from countries that maybe have it right in certain areas and ways that we could change.
Sorry, there was more.
Great point. Sylvia.
Thank you so much for this really amazing presentation and for really getting us thinking about how we can reimagine, as Tom said, in a very ambitious way, state-society relations, economic, social relations, and organization. And I wonder, it's a rather granular question. Who are your natural allies? Who are the organizations, groups, initiatives that support the work that you're doing, where you're supporting each other to kind of to move the needle a little bit?
I'm like, that's a very good question. No, a good answer. I don't,
Who's in the?
yeah, I'm trying to think about. What'd you say?
Like, who's in the coalition for the people?
Yeah, so I think it's like other organizations that are doing, so for Vocal, we organize folks who are directly impacted. There are like faith-based organizations that are aligned, who we ally with. There are like affinity-based groups, folks who are against Asian American hate, folks who are against like Jews for racial and justice and equality. There are education advocates who are aligned with us, who are focused on like children, as opposed to like teacher advocates. There are, I'm trying to think who else. So other folks who are in like the criminal justice spaces, juvenile justice spaces, also like some climate folks are aligned with us. And then really just like directly impacted community members are like our main base of supporters.
Political organizations.
I wouldn't call them natural.
No,
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. I think, okay, so what,
I mean, there's some elected.
yeah, what kind of Rita brought up was like political folks. There are some electeds now who are more natural allies. I think there is a shift in like electoral work to get like former organizers or folks who are more aligned. And so I think the folks who we ally with on the outside are now going into politics, and that is continuing. But I do think there are conflicts there that we are like currently kind of like working through, because who we're accountable, it changes. Like I'm accountable to my membership, same for a lot of our allies. But then I guess once you go into like the political arena, you're accountable to your seat and getting elected against. And so that creates some discord.
Yeah, I think we also have those natural and then maybe not as quite as natural allies. Our natural allies, we have this whole CDRC network in the state. There are other CDRCs not named that in other states. So those are really important allies. We actually have some great allies in some of the city agencies. So 311 actually sends a ton of people our way because they don't know. People call and they're like, tree is in my yard and I can get their tree out of my, or whatever it is, or they're so loud, and 311's like, New York Peace Institute, here you go. So so they're a really natural ally. Other city agencies, a lot of housing city agencies where tenants call and they don't really have a legal avenue to follow, but they want to figure out some way to resolve it. This happened a lot during the pandemic. Landlords and tenants that wanted to speak with each other, but didn't really have a way to go through the housing court system and wanted to just have a conversation. They would be referred from the city agencies over to us. There's an organization, a city agency called Oath that does all of the city's alternative dispute resolution practices, and we work very closely with them. And then we have allies that are a little bit more natural, but are pretty good. So the court system, we work very closely with, but of course there's lots of tensions that come up between what we want to see happen with mediation and what they want to see happen with mediation. They want mediation to take all the cases off their docket. We want mediation to be this practice that works for people who want to use it. So there's some conflict there. And then all the legal service providers, like the free legal service providers, are really good allies to us, but there is tension because they want to make sure that every single person who goes through the court system is represented by an attorney. And then we want to make sure that they also get to do mediation. And so there's definite ways for us to work together and have that overlap, but there's also limited resources. So they're like, if we could only do one of these things, we want all the money to come to the attorneys, which is, I get that. But when we're like, but if there's only money for this, we want it. So there's some tension, but where we can work together, it really is a great partnership.
Do you train mediators?
We do, yeah. That's where a lot of our income comes from, actually, a lot of our revenue. We do about 3 or 4 basic mediation trainings per year, plus an apprenticeship, a 12-week apprenticeship that you have to do role plays and act cases. And so yeah, we do a lot of training.
And who are your clients for that?
So primarily, this is actually a big thing that we've been focusing on because it's been a diversity issue, because the training is so expensive. Historically, it has attracted like older, white, retired, wealthier people who have the time and resources to take this training. And really what we want is to train the community who's doing really good work so that they can bring it back to other nonprofits and other community work that they're doing. And so now we're starting, but we also need this revenue. So now we've started to implement a scholarship program where like a quarter of the seats are reserved for community members at free or very low cost. And that's seen a huge difference because then we could say like, oh, you know, people at your organization are doing such great work. Like, do you want to see, you know, you want someone to, and that's started to make a huge difference. So I'm happy to see that shift.
Yeah. Did you do it in the schools? You train mediators in schools?
Yep, we do peer mediation training, and then also we'll train the administration and the teachers to do.
Yeah.
And sometimes an organization will contact us and say, we would like everybody in our organization to be trained in mediation skills. And we'll charge a fee and come in and do that.
And do you apply for grants?
Yeah, we do apply for grants, although we don't get that many grants for our training work. We do get grants for our programmatic work, but mostly our training is just funded by whatever people pay for their seat.
I mean, I don't want to hog the, but I just wanted to follow up on this training with the NYPD. And I can see why that would be contentious. And also, obviously, NYPD is not seen as a natural ally by any stretch of imagination, right? But here's the question. Are we then saying that they're beyond training? Or who else should train?
I mean, I'll just
Yeah,
say,
I'd
and then
love to, yeah.
yeah, I think the problem, I do think there's lots of room for NYPD to have some of this training. And we were focusing primarily on the community officers. So ones that were, I'm blanking on their name right now, but who are specifically walking the streets of the neighborhoods. But what I think we were starting to feel was that it was becoming a Band-Aid for like a larger issue. And so while I do feel that there's room, like that it is essential for police officers to learn these skills, particularly if they're interacting with, you know, neighbor disputes on a regular basis or domestic disputes on a regular basis. I think it's important for them to have these, but there just needs to be this overhaul that happens first. And then we could come in and be trained. And I think all of these organizations can be doing training. And I think there's room for organizations to work together on this training. Like, what do they need to, here are the mediation skills, but what else do they need to be trained in? I mean, lots more training, but pass it over to you. I'm sure you have a lot more to say.
Yeah, I mean, the glib answer is yes, we would say they are beyond training.
Right.
But I think, like before, like to your point, like before training, there needs to be an acknowledgement of harm. Like I think, and that goes into like peace building and conflict resolution. Like we can't start at like today, like, okay, we're gonna give them tools to go into the community that they've literally decimated over centuries. Like that's not gonna work. And I think that's some issues that we're having with like there's a lawsuit against the NYPD that came from the AG's office for how they like abuse people during the 2020 protests. And at one point there was like mediation and trying to figure out like what would happen and what do community groups want. And we were like, are they going to acknowledge that they've harmed us? And that was a non-starter. And so I think like, if we're not going to have that at the baseline, that there's no amount of training that's going to create trust in communities. Yeah, and I think there are people who are better suited to have those interactions with community members than folks who are like carrying guns. Yeah.
Agreed. Yeah, I think a lot of times their training just runs counter to what we're trying to do as a dispute resolution. So yes, in an ideal world, we have all these other agencies going in, but even if they have some training so that they could recognize like, oh, this situation needs this or this situation, or even they know how to respond for the time until another agency gets there. You know, I think in the long run, there's potential, but one of the things that I thought of when you were speaking is, you know, we worked closely with the Civilian Complaint Review Board. So that's where civilians can bring complaints about police officers and try to resolve it, often through mediation or other dispute resolution means. I mean, that board has been like gutted over time. They continually take away their authority and their power to do anything. So if we saw that a board that whose entire purpose is to have these conversations between police and the community had a little more authority to do anything, then you start to feel a little more encouraged, like, okay, there's room to bring these practices in other ways. But
On the Zoom? Oh,
Keli mentioned earlier that how the homeless person can get a housing, but actually the landlord wouldn't accept him.
Mhm.
That like, I've been thinking, I had this frustration for a long time. I feel like the policy is one thing and the implementation of the policy is another thing.
Mhm.
I'm a mother and I've seen like changing tables like this high. I'm like, how are you gonna fold your laundry? Right? So I feel like, yes, there are policies, well, not every bathroom has a changing table. It's great that they have it. But I feel like it's more like check the box. I have this thing here, but I don't care if it really works for people. So I'm thinking that, you know, there are policies and then, but like how, are there like any systems or like, do people monitor if that works or like if it works for everyone? Have you guys done the work or does the government have a group of people?
Yeah, I think that is a really good question. And one of the gaps, I think, in advocacy, where it's like, we'll pass a bill that's amazing, and then it's not being implemented. The oversight board that's supposed to make sure it's being implemented was appointed by an elected official who is counter to us. And so they're not going to check for anything. I think one example of that is like halt solitary, which is the bill that passed last year. I don't know time anymore. It passed recently, 2020. Okay, yes, 3 years ago. Goodness gracious. Okay, which limited solitary confinement in New York State jails and prisons. And that implementation has been awful from the start. And so to answer your question, like there's nothing like inherent in our government structure that runs as like a check to make sure like, okay, we passed this bill, now we want to make sure that it's actually being followed through. Which is why like accountability is so important and is a thing that needs to be like legislated alongside every policy change that we're fighting for, which is why like I think for Vocal, one of our like priorities is like ending qualified immunity. And the goal of that, like for our civil rights union, is predominantly around like policing and corrections and the harms that those, you know, officers wreak unchecked in our communities, but it's also to create like an accountability structure within state law that's like, okay, we've created this right for people, and now we've also created a mechanism if that right is violated. And right now that's something that does not exist, at least on the state level. Yeah, and so for the city FEPS issue with folks being denied housing from landlords, the enforcement mechanism is supposed to be, oh my gosh, I'm so upset I can't think of the name of that like office, but they're like attorneys that are hired by the city to do the like anti-discrimination work. And that has been under, like there have been vacancies for years.
I think it's the Division of Human Rights.
Is it
That,
okay,
yeah, in the
perfect.
city, yeah.
And so I think to your point, like it's one of those things where it's like we need money in the budget to actually fill those roles so that the person who is supposed to be a check on the landlords are actually doing their jobs.
It comes to the budget again.
Yeah, it's always the budget, it's always a money issue. But yeah.
It makes me think about, so one of the types of cases that we did in mediation was cases for American with Disabilities Act. So if somebody, for example, in a wheelchair cannot get into a store, the only enforcement mechanism is that a private attorney takes their case and sues the business. That's the only mechanism for
Yeah.
change. And it comes with a lot of problems that this is, yeah, first of all, it becomes the attorney's making as much money as they possibly can off of the case. Most of the time, the plaintiffs are only entitled to about $1,000. So it's not even worth, it's not, you know, it's, so they will often file like 80 cases with an attorney in an effort to like make a living for themselves while the attorney is getting like $50,000 per case. And it harms the small business. And when it's when it's a small business, it could harm the business in a lot of ways. It's like a restaurant and they're saying like, okay, you owe us $50,000 and also renovate your entire bathroom. Okay, should you have to renovate your bathroom so that it's handicap accessible? Absolutely. But that should probably be your only thing. The enforcement shouldn't be having to pay this attorney all this money to do this. So like the enforcement mechanisms that we do have for certain things are so haphazard that, yeah, I think that is a huge gap.
Yeah.
Even if we could get all this stuff done, like how do we then have a system where the government is helping us actually oversee all this stuff?
And I think there are like oversight boards, like like CCRB is oversight for the police. Board of Corrections is oversight for the Department of Corrections. And these entities have very little power. And so it's like empowering those like accountability structures that we already have and then creating the ones that we don't.
Question. So yes, for me is like how wanting to kind of change policy or vocalize like what do you want the budget to be or how do you want it to look like? How do you combat disappointment when you do the process, you go through all this work and you rally people, you sign petitions, you go up to City Hall and advocate for this is what you want, but then it doesn't happen. So I guess one example, one anecdotal experience for me was when Eric Adams was running for mayor, he was advocating 1% budget for city parks. As soon as he got elected, slashed it, did not even happen. It was less than 0.5%, it was like 0.4 or something like that. So then me with a few local organizations, we like got people to sign petitions and kind of like advocate towards that, didn't amount to anything. And then I know a few people that I spoke to kind of just lost morale and was like, well, I tried, I guess nothing is gonna change. So how do you kind of combat that and get like a rally to continue and not just stop there? I mean, I know that's like a
Yeah, if you were answer.
Yeah.
no.
I mean, I think on a personal level, it's like being very clear about where your joy comes from and investing in that. And I think on the like organizing level, it's centering yourself with like knowing that you're not in this fight alone, knowing that like there's a legacy of like freedom fighters in this country and we are just a part of that. And if we can make things marginally better for the folks who are going to pick up the fight after us, then we've done good work. Yeah, disappointment is a part of it. Like,
I guess my thing is like for the people who not only enjoy but actually want to see change, I get. But those are the people out voting, those are the people actually wanting change to occur. But how about the rest of the people, the majority who just aren't voting or aren't like pushing out these agendas, they're trying to.
Are you asking like how do we like get them involved and like mobilize them?
Yeah, I don't know.
It's hard.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's like I think on one side of it, you have to acknowledge that it just is really disappointing and is really overwhelming sometimes. And there's nothing you can do. And there's chunks of time where I'm like, I'm done. Like, I'm done. I'm not doing it, and then trying from different angles. Like, that's the best thing that I could say is like, sometimes like, I like ran for office one time and I was like, okay, that one didn't work. And I did all this work for New York Peace Institute. I'm like, that didn't work. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to get involved in politics in like this way to try to, and I think just like mixing it up and trying from different angles so that A, you don't get burned out from one approach, but B, you feel like, okay, one of these will work. It gives you hope that like the next thing will work. And in terms of rallying people, I do think we're getting to a point where unfortunately, the majority of people are not happy with the way things are working for them. And so while we may not agree on what the next step is, we are getting to that point. And I don't know what comes from there, but I think it'll happen on its own when the system just isn't working anymore.
Yeah, and I think for me, like with coordinated campaigns, it's like one, redefining what victories are and what successes are, because like the big win is the big win and it'll take years, decades, whatever. But there are like smaller, like concrete wins that you can define within a campaign. It's like, we want to get X number of people signed on, or like creating what we call like stoplight campaigns. which are like not necessarily a part of like that bigger goal, but like are smaller. So like, again, I think our homelessness union, they do amazing work. And so it's like, as we talk to folks in the community who are directly impacted, they're like, okay, this is an issue going on in my shelter right now. And we're like, all right, we're gonna fight for this thing. And it's an easier thing to win. And so it's like, yes, we got that win. We also show folks that we care about their issues and we will rally behind them. And then other people are seeing it and they're like, all right, we're gonna fight with you for more stuff. And so I think one, just like always having your ear to what folks are experiencing on the ground, like carving out those like smaller, but still significant wins that are going to like mobilize folks for the bigger win and actually win like tangible changes in people's lives.
And make it
Yeah.
fun sometimes.
Yeah.
I've seen vocal make it fun.
Yes, 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 yes.
Yeah, that's
Yes, and
important.
feed people along the way.
Yeah.
You know?
That's what we did.
Yes, yes.
So baby steps, food.
Yes.
Got it.
Sadly, we've exhausted an hour together. I want to really thank the two of you and everybody who's here for coming, not only today, but throughout the year to the different seminars that we've run. Thank you for being our ultimate seminar of the year.
Thanks for having us.
We hope that the relationships that have begun this year will continue. I'll say for everybody who's here, and for those who are online, please keep following PrEP online, follow it on, do we have Ally, Twitter, Facebook,
Instagram.
LinkedIn, all of those things. And, we do want to link up with the organizations and, we'd love this conversation to continue in whatever way is sort of natural and constructive for all of us as we move on. I'll let you ask your question, but first I want to make sure that these two get a round of applause.
Is it possible to like share like contact information?
So like,
Yeah, for being with us. And
Yeah,
we'll
this is
see you
fun.
again.
Yeah, it was really fun.
Thanks so
Thanks
much.
for being a good part of
Yes,
this.
no, I should learn more about
Yeah,
it.
that's- like, oh,
I
that's so much
saw
overlap.
so many, I'm like, I got it. I like only got 20 more access today. I already did something.
Yeah, no, because I think even in the budget, we're talking about like alternatives, to all these things, but. It's really, yeah.
I don't think there's any like, there's really no. Things, it's just like one.
Doing well.